Hello, everybody. This is StephenGray, of course, I think, if you're looking at the sign behind me there. And this is the StephenGray Vision YouTube channel. And the purpose of these is to share inspiration and information on the needed consciousness transformation on this planet, with a focus on psychedelics, because they have been influencing humanity for quite some time, perhaps even millennia, but they are also poised to take, I think, a much greater and a more important role in the times to come, as conditions tend to get intensified, I think we could safely say. And for that reason, I have been interviewing what are, for the most part, leading figures in this kind of work, psychedelics and consciousness transformation. And one of those people who definitely falls easily into that category is Jeremy Narby. And he is my guest today, so I'm really happy to have Jeremy with me. Just going to give a quick bio of Jeremy, and then we'll get right into some questions. He's an anthropologist with a PhD from Stanford University. Jeremy's the author of several books, including The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge. And along with several other books, as I say, his new book with Rafael Chanchari Pizuri, which is titled Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and the Pursuit of Knowledge. Rafael is an elder of the Shawi people and a traditional healer living in Iquitos, Peru. So this new book will really form the basis of our conversation today, or interview, actually, more accurately speaking. And currently, Jeremy works as Amazonian Projects Director for Nouvelle Planète. And again, for us English-only speakers, that word translates, or those two words translate as New Planet. It's a non-profit organization that promotes the economic and cultural empowerment of indigenous peoples. Jeremy lives in Switzerland, and that's where he's joining me on Zoom today, while I'm here in Vancouver, British Columbia. And just before I bring Jeremy on, or he's there, of course, visually, but also, pardon me, just want to mention that these interviews are also available on Anchor.fm, that's ANCHOR.fm, and it has connections to now the semi-reviled Spotify and some other channels. Excuse me. Yes, so where was I? Anyway, that's fine. We will carry on from here, and I will bring... Oh, I know what I wanted to say. I just want a quick honoring shout-out to the recently deceased Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk who was one of the guiding lights on this planet during his life. A remarkable figure, and if you don't know of him, you might want to look into his work a little bit. So with that said, welcome, Jeremy. I was going to say again, but people don't know that.
Thanks, Stephen.
So let's just get right into it. The book, which I have in my hand here, is Plant Teachers, as I mentioned in the introduction, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and the Pursuit of Knowledge, with Rafael Chanchari Pizuri. And I've read it. I loved it. Really, honestly, I'm not just saying that because of the situation we're in here. I thought it was a lot of excellent information, and I've been around these medicine fields for decades, and probably taken ayahuasca more than 36 times, and been in the Native American church where tobacco is used as a prayer medicine, and down in South America with the mapacho, cigarettes, and so on. And there were still lots in this book that I did not know. And so for the, what you might call less tutored, so to speak, layperson, I think it will be even more remarkable, and I would hope move the conversation forward. So you've divided the book into essentially two parts, with tobacco being the first half, more or less, and ayahuasca the second half, with a bit of overlap on certain issues that apply to both, of course. But since tobacco came first, I'd like to get into that with you, or I'd like you to get into it. And I want to start with a quote that you put into the book from the Asháninka people, who say that tobacco is the #1 plant teacher. I find that quite a stunning statement, actually. Not completely surprising to me, as I mentioned, but it will be, I think, to many so-called, Westerners that would be watching or listening to an interview like this. So, can you explain why those people might say that about tobacco?
Yeah, certainly. You find across the Amazon, I mean, there are 400 different indigenous cultures across the Amazon basin. It's a huge place, and there's a lot of diversity. But uh, the overwhelming majority of Amazonian people work with tobacco. And when I say work, I mean shamanic work. Um, they have strong shamanic traditions. Anthropologists have documented this, and really, it's the number one medicinal plant according to indigenous Amazonian people. Um, they use it as a disinfectant. Uh, as the tobacco leaves can be applied directly to wounds, and they help wounds heal. Tobacco smoke is blown on wounds, on snake bites, on any kind of venomous bite. It's a painkiller, and it's also a diagnostic tool, which is that um, when you go and see the shaman or the healer, many of these specialists work with tobacco. The people I lived with in the Peruvian Amazon, the Asháninka people, their word for shaman is sheri piari. Sheri means tobacco. And so when you have any kind of problem, an illness, or you've lost your mojo hunting, or somebody's stolen your chickens and you want to figure out who it might be, any kind of problem like this, your child has a fever, you go and see the person who knows, the doctor. That's what the word doctor means in Latin, the one who knows more. In Asháninka, it would be you go and see the tobacco doctor, Sheri Piari. Piari is a doctor, and Sheri is tobacco. And what the tobacco doctor will do is listen to your problem or look at it, depending on what it is, and then take some tobacco, often smoking it, sometimes eating it as a paste. And in the stimulation that the tobacco gives to the healer, a solution might come up. So it's a plant that is used more than any other plant. And for example, in ayahuasca traditions in the Western Amazon, um, all indigenous practitioners use tobacco as they are taking ayahuasca. They blow tobacco on the smoke on the ayahuasca before serving it. In their view, tobacco and ayahuasca are inseparable. Um, the Shipibo people, I mean, I could go on giving examples. I'll give this one in a representation of that a Shipibo shaman gave an anthropologist of how Shipibo people see the world and the cosmos. You see the earth that's surrounded by a big serpent, and then you see the celestial cosmic vault, and then there is two arrows crossing, uh, like the cardinal points, north, east, west, south, except what you have is anaconda, jaguar, tobacco, ayahuasca. Well, anaconda and jaguar are the two top predators that these are animals that eat many different kinds of animals, but nobody eats them. They're at the top of the food chain. And they're considered to be the most powerful animals, and shamans in that part of the world tend to identify with these animals. So anaconda and jaguar are key players in their cosmology, and tobacco and ayahuasca are as well. This is for the Shipibo people. I'm not saying that it's like this for all the different indigenous people in the Amazon, but it comes up just regularly how central tobacco is in their understanding of the world, and also as a means to understand the world. And that's what these different plant teachers are. Plant teacher is a concept that comes from the Western Amazon, from the Peruvian Amazon. Scientists have studied it, and they've determined that there are 55 different plants considered to be plant teachers by people in the Peruvian Amazon. Not all of them are psychoactive, but many of them are. And tobacco and ayahuasca are certainly at the top of the list in terms of the plants that are most frequently used as teachers. Some of these plant teachers are frankly pretty difficult to work with. I'm thinking of the datura plants, for example, Toei. Really, being a Toei specialist is something that's fairly difficult to keep your mind functioning properly in the long term. But tobacco is a plant that is used daily for years by some of these specialists. And so I'd also like to say that it's not my plant. In other words, I'm talking about this as an anthropologist who's spent the last 35 years of my life working with indigenous Amazonian people, occasionally studying them, or certainly writing about their knowledge and in dialogue with them. But I myself am not a tobacco consumer. I have experience with tobacco, and I actually mentioned it at the beginning of the book. But it's not a very deep experience. It's not something that I've wanted to repeat regularly. And I guess that just to end this kind of long answer to your question, it's important to understand that the kind of tobacco that Amazonian people are working with contains something like 20 times more nicotine than the blonde tobacco that Euro-Americans cultivated in Virginia and so on. Tobacco comes originally from Peru, from the Peruvian Amazon or the foothills of the Andes, Peru and Ecuador. That's where Nicotiana tabacum and Nicotiana rustica, which are the two main species of tobacco used to, well, across, be it by Amazonian shamans, but also by the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry uses Nicotiana tabacum, but it is a kind of tobacco that has been, let's say, selected for low levels of nicotine. And then once it has been harvested, industrial cigarette producers blend in 600 or so different chemicals that, when they're burned, turn into all kinds of poisonous byproducts. The Western experience of tobacco, which has mainly been through industrial cigarettes, is really something that, at least in chemical terms, is extremely different from the strong, dark, I would say pure Amazonian tobacco that indigenous people work with in South America.
Yeah, excellent.
So you can't fire up a few sort of cigarettes and say, this, I'm working with a plant teacher. It has nothing to do with it.
No. So a few moments ago, you mentioned that the nicotine content in South American tobacco is upwards of 20 times as much in the plant as the industrial tobaccos. And I don't remember specifically. I just want to ask you a question about this. I don't remember specifically in which book I saw it. I have a vague memory. It might have been some people called the Warani, but that may not be right. It was about 20, 25 years ago when I read this. In any case, there's a photograph in this book of a guy, a native person from this particular tribe in South America, holding what looks like a giant cone-like thing full of tobacco. And they, as more or less, as I recall, what he was doing and what they do in that particular community is they prepare extensively for a serious quote unquote psychedelic or visionary journey by isolating or something for a week or two, meditating, maybe fasting, things like that. And then they have a few massive tokes on these things and completely cross the barrier, as it were. So I guess there could be a few questions with that, but given the context of this particular YouTube channel, not like scientifically, literally as a psychedelic, because I think that would be acting on the 5-HT2A receptors, but as a principle. Can you talk about the quote unquote psychedelic or visionary kind of use of tobacco in South America?
Yeah, sure. It's actually, I think, pretty interesting because if you're interested in psychedelics or hallucinogens, as they used to be called, LSD or psilocybin, and now, of course, ayahuasca and DMT. People don't think that tobacco has anything to do with that kind of category of plant or substance, but this powerful South American tobacco, I think, is correctly understood as hallucinogenic. It can induce visions. It can get you thinking some pretty strange stuff and having some odd perceptions of your own body, where you seem to be transforming into an animal, and these kinds of reports come up from people who use this strong tobacco. It's fairly clear that nicotine works on acetylcholine receptors, and so it's more of a deliriant hallucinogenic experience than what would be called a true visionary psychedelic experience. As you point out, the true psychedelics are defined, maybe somewhat arbitrarily, as those that affect the 5-HT2A receptors. So, fair enough. If that's how we're going to define the word psychedelic, then tobacco is not included. But yes, when you ask Amazonian shamans, they're fairly clear. They're taking huge doses of nicotine, and this is not for beginners, by the way, because if you are what they call naive in terms of tobacco, if you've never had tobacco and nicotine, and suddenly you take a very large dose of tobacco juice, say, it can kill you quite simply. I think it's pretty clear that most of the, ayahuasca, as it's classically prepared, let's just say, it's difficult to drink enough ayahuasca, which only contains the vine and, let's say, some chacruna leaves. The lethal dose is something like 20 times the effective dose. This would be like drinking 2 liters of ayahuasca. It's almost impossible to stomach that much ayahuasca without vomiting it back. But if you mix tobacco leaves into your ayahuasca, depending how many you put in there, there can be massive amounts of nicotine in this tobacco-laced ayahuasca, and it has happened. And tobacco can easily kill people. What happens when you take it often enough is that you develop more nicotinic receptors. The cells in your body are better able to handle it, and this is how these shamans work. It's tobacco nicotine is a poison. I mean, it's important to understand that in this case, it's fairly clear why tobacco plants produce nicotine. It's an insecticide. Insects that come and eat tobacco leaves die because the nicotine poisons them. Actually, if you could extract all the nicotine contained in just 2 or 3 ordinary cigarettes by boiling them and purifying it into a pure drop, that would be enough nicotine to kill somebody simply by putting it on their tongue or on their skin. The reason why that doesn't happen when you smoke those cigarettes is that most of the nicotine is destroyed in the combustion. Fortunately, that's the only really positive aspect of smoking tobacco, is that it stops you from killing yourself with the nicotine that's there. It's that powerful. So when you, for example, boil tobacco leaves and make an extraction like that, and then you drink that tobacco extract, you're taking very large doses of nicotine. And once again, it can be dangerous depending on how accustomed your body is to it. I think I kind of got lost there. I can't even remember what the question was.
Well, no, that's fine, because I'd like to ask you this question. Let me put it this way, just for something different. Let's say you were writing a science fiction novel and you placed it, let's say, 20 to 30 years in the future. And in that novel, it would be kind of your utopian novel, so to speak. It would be the most effective, most applicable use. And I'm asking this question because that's kind of the focus of this YouTube channel: is how can we offer inspiration and information that is applicable. So in say 20 or 30 years, once tobacco is understood properly, could you speculate as to how it might have taken its place in the wider cultures, how it might best be used?
That's an interesting question, and for me, pretty challenging, because I kind of make it my speciality not to speculate.
Okay.
and not to look in the future, and to try to focus on understanding the present and naming it properly. But for you, Stephen, I'll make the effort. And this is also maybe just the habit of an anthropologist. But I mean, the old joke is that the joke: how many anthropologists does it take to change a light bulb? And I think the answer is it depends on the context. No.
So maybe I could rephrase that a little bit, Jeremy. Maybe I could just say, like, do you feel that tobacco can be used more widely by non-indigenous people in effective ways? And if so, how might that be? And what kind of attitudes and practices might be involved?
Okay, well, thank you. And I was going to try to almost go in that direction and try to answer that. The thing is that's pretty clear just in the Amazon, before extrapolating from the Amazon, what kind of comes out of indigenous tobacco use is that there is a fundamental ambiguity. When you work with these powerful plants like tobacco and ayahuasca, where they can be used. So yes, you can set up an alliance with the plant. You prepare your body so that you can work with this plant on a regular basis. The plant will give you information, points of view, and so on. But then this can be used to heal people, but it can also be used to harm people. And that will depend. And my co-author, Raphael Chanchari, talks about this. He talks about the mother of tobacco, let's say the personality of the tobacco plant. Raphael considers tobacco to be a powerful entity, and an entity that, if you're not well prepared, it really depends a lot on your intention, it can mislead you and can lead you into causing harm to those around you. Why does tobacco do this? Well, he gives a pretty ambiguous answer on that count, but still, the point is, it depends on who is working with the plant and what their intention is. And this is also true in ayahuasca. So it's not as if it's just a substance and then you give it to people and then they become healers and do good things in the world. Unfortunately, I mean, wouldn't it be so wonderful? Everybody would become a healer and an ecologist and start caring for other species, and we'd clean up the planet in no time. And all we'd have to do is consume these intelligent plant teachers, and all would be well. But just looking at what, let's just say, indigenous Amazonian people report about what they themselves have done as they've used these plants over the years, indigenous Amazonian people have been clear from the start that at least half of Amazonian shamanism is called sorcery. It's the shadow side of all this.
The brujos.
It tends to get omitted when Western people go down to the Amazon and they find ayahuasca or what have you, or maybe it might even be tobacco, and then they come back. Often they'll be talking about healing a lot, but they won't be talking about the darker side or acknowledging it. What might it be like in the future? My guess would be that it would be not all that different from what it has been in the past. In other words, we're dealing with power plants. It's about power, it's about knowledge, and this is double-edged, and it really depends on the people who use it. And that's the important thing, I think, that one of the messages to get across to people is that if you're going to work with these powerful plants, first of all, you have to know them, because you can get into deep water. So it's worth, before dabbling, it's worth looking into it a little bit. And then it's also about working on yourself so that you can handle these plants. Otherwise, they can mislead you quickly.
Is that what you meant in the book when you said that plants have two spirits?
Well, that's how Raphael put it. And then we had a long discussion about the word spirit or the word soul, and just how an indigenous Amazonian person understands that differently from somebody who's been brought up in a Euro-American culture. But yes, that is fundamentally the indigenous Amazonian view of plants like tobacco and ayahuasca. They have two faces, two sides to them. We would like something to be clear and simple, but when you're talking about this kind of realm, in the Amazonian view, I mean, think of it as if you think of the representation of yin and yang, you have the white part that has a little bit of black in it, and the black part that has a little bit of white in it, and they're wrapped around each other. And so this is the association of contraries, that they can't be separated out, that it is good and evil, healing and harming, wrapped around. And there is no sort of pure white or pure black. This is actually also an Amazonian concept, is that if you are a shaman, let's say, and you're working with these plants, and you actually are managing to heal people, this will be a source of power for you. You will have accessed the power of these plants and used it to heal people. And so people around you will say, oh, this is wonderful. This fellow is on a white healing path. But actually, the more a shaman manages to do that, the greater will be the temptation to abuse the power. And so what Amazonian people say is that the more successful the shaman, the more you actually have to keep an eye on that person.
Indeed.
And that there never is a pure white healing shamanism who's all good and never does anything bad.
Nicely put, and also, I think that's universally applied. That there's a reason that the old cliche has not faded away, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it applies to anyone who gains influence over other people. It's a sneaky one, so I'm glad you pointed that out, actually. So
The just about that is
yeah.
that Amazonian people, because they acknowledge this fairly explicitly, they also propose a hygiene of power. That is, if you have had power come through you, and so you have that power, so that it does not corrupt you, what you need to do is diet. Diet is also an Amazonian concept. It doesn't mean go on a diet. It means restrict the foods you eat so that they're bland. You diet human company as well. So you go someplace where you're alone and you sit in quietness and you eat bland food. You suffer a little bit and you become more humble and you come down from your ego inflating power thing. And that's how you can renew a kind of a healthy contact with that realm without getting your head all bloated by your own achievements.
Yeah, nice.
What's interesting is that in here in like the northern world or the Western world, the industrial world, we know that power corrupts, and we know that politicians and people who get into positions of power have a hard time letting go. But we hardly ever hear about hygiene of power. I mean, everybody's always trying to get reelected, in fact.
Yeah, well, in the spiritual realm as well, I have a background in my past with Tibetan Buddhism, and in that tradition, they say it's really important for any guru to still keep a strong connection to their mentors, their teachers, who can sort of slap you around if you get out of control. That's their notion. That's their version of the La Dieta, I suppose. Jeremy, if you don't mind, I'd like to move along because the other half of the book, you've alluded to it a little bit, is on ayahuasca, and we're about halfway through the time that we have together. This is probably a good segue point because you talk about the sort of portion of white and black and all that kind of stuff, and that's actually literally the case, physically the case, so to speak, with the different kinds of ayahuasca that in the book you talk about the sky or yellow ayahuasca and black ayahuasca. And so I'd like to ask you to just sort of briefly, in layperson's terms, describe the difference and why for us, quote unquote, Westerners, that's actually applicable or important to understand.
Well, it's a point of contention in science. I'm talking botany here. Scientists have claimed for a long time that ayahuasca was one species, Banisteriopsis caapi, a vine that grows in the Amazon, and that's all there is to it.
So,
Amazonian people have been saying for a long time, no, there are different kinds of ayahuasca, yellow ayahuasca, black ayahuasca, mariri ayahuasca, thunder ayahuasca. Some of these vines have knots, others are smooth. They have different kind of bark qualities. They can be more or less harsh. And when you scrape the bark away and you look at the inner wood, it can be whitish, yellowish, or darkish. And so that's why Amazonian people, the indigenous people, but also mestizo people recognize these differences, just like you would recognize different varieties of cannabis, for example. I mean, people who grow the plant say, well, this is such and such, this is such and such. They have different effects, different tastes. And we're not going to get into the taxonomy of cannabis because that's also another swamp. But in the case of ayahuasca, I mean, to this day, in cannabis, people are still fighting. Is there one species, two species, three species? Richard Evans Schultes, the ethnobotanist, weighed in on cannabis. He also weighed in on ayahuasca. He wrote already in the 1970s that the indigenous perspective on the different kinds of ayahuasca was an enigma. He called it an avenue for future botanical research. I think this was like in 1974 that he wrote that. But that research was not conducted, oddly enough. And it was only in 2018 that a team of international scientists has launched an investigation into these different kinds of ayahuasca. I think doing plant genetics would be a place to start. I don't think that research has reached its conclusions yet, but one can move beyond, let's just say, okay, the knowledge that science has of ayahuasca has limits, and this is one of them, pretty clear one. But Amazonian people, they don't need scientists to tell them if there's one, two, or three different species here. They recognize the differences, and they say that you can feel, and if you prepare ayahuasca with yellow ayahuasca, it'll be a different experience than if you do the same thing with black ayahuasca. And a practitioner like my co-author Rafael Chanchari is pretty clear that yellow ayahuasca, which is also called sky ayahuasca, is what people from outside the Amazon and who have relatively little experience with this powerful plant, that is the kind of ayahuasca they should be working with if they want to avoid getting into dark places. Rafael claims that when you work with the darker kinds of ayahuasca, speaking literally, the black ayahuasca, the Mariri ayahuasca, you get into, darker territories when it comes to witchcraft and sorcery and these things. Now, then there's the question, okay, well, what if you don't believe in sorcery? What if you don't believe in any of this stuff? Well, that is, that's a complicated one. It would be, I myself am an agnostic, but when it comes to things like ayahuasca, I tend to trust practitioners, and if they're saying, look, there is this thing here that if you use it, it can cause you to start wanting to harm people and so forth. It's certainly true in the Amazon. Whether materialist atheists from, let's say, New York go down to the Amazon, will they be impervious to the experience of this darker kind of ayahuasca? Actually, that would not be an ethical piece of research to conduct. I think that, my advice would be to avoid dabbling with plants that are described as being dangerous in that sense by indigenous practitioners.
Yeah, I think that's a very important one, as this ayahuasca brew spreads around the world. And in a very similar vein, in the book, Raphael also warned against, I believe you even used the term warned, but you could correct me there, against admixtures in the plant. And I guess partly for the same reasons, but can you say a wee bit more about that?
Well, this is also something that probably a lot of people don't realize about ayahuasca, because you get a lot of even scientists writing things like that there is standard ayahuasca, and that standard ayahuasca is the vine and the chacruna, and so it contains the harmaline alkaloids of the vine, and it contains the DMT of the chacruna, and this is standard ayahuasca. But actually, that's rubbish. Ayahuasca is first and foremost a vine. And then it is also the brew that is made with the vine as a basis. Some ayahuascas are pure vine, and the anthropological literature is full of descriptions of people who traditionally use vine-only ayahuasca. Then what ayahuasca is a cocktail. It is, you can add many different kinds of plants to the ayahuasca vine, and then you will learn about the properties of that plant. And Jonathan Ott, in his book, Ayahuasca Analogs, listed 97 different plants used traditionally by people to add to ayahuasca. So what is in any given ayahuasca depends on who's preparing it, what plants are available, and what kind of brew they want to come up with. There is no standard ayahuasca, just like there is no standard cocktail. A cocktail is necessarily a mix. And there can be many different kinds of cocktails. There can be many different kinds of ayahuasca. They can contain tobacco, datura, coca, toé, meaning to say they can contain not just the harmala alkaloids of the vine, but other psychoactive substances like nicotine, scopolamine, cocaine, and dimethyltryptamine. So depending on who brewed the ayahuasca and what they put in it, you can be talking about something that is a completely different thing, because a cocktail will essentially be fruit juice and alcohol. And so the only psychoactive part is the alcohol. But with ayahuasca, you don't know whether it's just the harmala alkaloids, whether there's DMT in there. Maybe there's no DMT, but there's nicotine. So it's a psychoactive cocktail. And you really do gain from knowing just what's in there. My co-author, Rafael Chanchari, who is an ayahuasquero and a practitioner, he thinks that he likes to stick to the basic ayahuasca mix of the vine and the chacruna. So he is talking about a sort of a DMT brew. He's not for adding all kinds of other plants in there. No nicotine, no toé, no scopolamine, no coca, none of that. He says, when you're from out of town, keep it simple. Keep it to yellow ayahuasca and some chacruna, and there you don't need to mix in all these other plants that can turn it into something else again.
Well, speaking of that, I was really interested in something you addressed briefly in the book that takes it even further in the direction of simplicity. And you quoted Gail Highpine saying that the vine without the inclusion of a DMT-containing plant is, and I'm quoting here, the teacher, the healer, the guide. I think that's a pretty stunning statement for those of us, like even me, who don't know. I didn't know about that. So can you say why that somebody like that would say that?
Well, I've actually had the experience of taking vine-only ayahuasca. And it's very interesting if you're used to the chacruna-containing kind that has this DMT imagery going on. Because without that DMT element, there are still visions. They're slower, they're more subtle, their colors are less bright, they move less fast. But the state is full of, it's very meditative. You do get the self-awareness, the teaching. Yes, not for nothing do indigenous Amazonians call it after the name of the vine, because the vine by itself does the job. It purges, it teaches, it heals. And in that view, what the chacruna does with the DMT that it contains is it turns the lights up. It makes the visions brighter and easier to see. And so they say this can be useful for beginners because then you get it, you see it. But that somehow, actually, for quite a few practitioners, these visions, these bright visions, are more of a distraction, and the important part of what's going on happens at a deeper, less spectacular level. But I'm sure that there would be people who quibble with this. But the point is that this is a point of view among indigenous Amazonians. And actually, there was a very interesting piece of research by a biochemist from Estonia, Hele Kasik. She and her colleagues recently sampled more than 100 different kinds of ayahuascas in South America, half in neo-shamanic centers that cater for Europeans and North Americans, and the other half used by indigenous Amazonians, not with foreign visitors. And the neo-shamanic samples had, on average, 57% more DMT than the ayahuasca sampled among indigenous Amazonians. So showing that Westerners, they want to show, they're like Yosemite Sam. I want to show, and they want their money's worth. Yeah. They want the lights, they want the spectacle, they want the fireworks, and so they get DMT heavy ayahuascas, which Hele Kasik says emphasizes tripping over healing. But at some point, I think that when you get interested in the vine beyond the kind of fireworks, turning down the lights and is interesting.
That's fascinating. I actually was going to bring her up if you hadn't. So thank you for that. And I think these are really valuable points for people that are, that as this plant again spreads around the world, it needs to be understood in these, these deeper levels. We're sort of at that stage now where ayahuasca's been part of the cultures now for 20 years or so, and it's like, let's go further now. So speaking of that. Ayahuasca also has more narrowly defined medical benefits as well. You've spoken about. Can you elaborate on that, please?
You're talking about the vine.
Well, I'm not sure whether it was just the vine or the vine with the DMT, but just using the term ayahuasca having health benefits.
Yes. Well, the vine precisely. All by itself contains harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine. And these Harmala alkaloids have recently been discovered to be antioxidant, promoters of the immune system, promoters of the growth of new neurons. They're anti-tumor, anti-inflammatory. If you want to enhance your immune system and strengthen your body, it would seem that there's nothing like a regular extract from the ayahuasca vine. This is not just, some speculation. This actually refers to ongoing research. The scientific community is waking up now to the therapeutic potential of the substances contained in the ayahuasca vine. And it seems also that the therapeutic effects of these different substances are enhanced by these substances being ingested together. In other words, it's not just the harmine. So you don't just extract the harmine and take the harmine. It is that the ayahuasca vine itself is actually a kind of a cocktail of these three main Harmala alkaloids. and several other bioactive substances that have not been studied properly yet. So researchers do talk about the entourage effect of how these different molecules work together, and the sum, the whole is greater than just the parts individually. The sum of the parts is greater than the parts separately.
Indeed.
So there we have it. Meanwhile, it would seem that even if you are talking about an ayahuasca that also contains chacruna and therefore DMT, DMT itself appears to have health-enhancing properties. It also seems to enhance the immune system, to act as an antioxidant that protects tissues, and that may also promote the growth of new neurons. And this is also research that is being conducted. So people don't usually think of ayahuasca in those terms, but yes, it would seem that it's ayahuasca can be good for your health, not only because it purges you, but it can have a positive impact on the body. It has mainly been studied up until now for its impact on the mind as a psychedelic, let's say. But so the physiological impact of ayahuasca is well, a new field of research and a promising one.
You know, I respect your what's the word, discipline, in terms of not wanting to step beyond your breadth of knowledge as an anthropologist. But I'd like to ask you this question anyway, since you have personally worked with these plants yourselves for a long time, yourself. What for someone who's not familiar, right? There are a few of those around still with the use of these plants. What are they doing? Like as a spiritual plant, why do they work? Or when they're used properly?
My friend and colleague Luis Eduardo Luna, who's written several key books about ayahuasca, once said that all the big questions concerning ayahuasca remain without answers. So for the moment, it's unclear how ayahuasca works. They've started to put DMT-containing ayahuasca, to give that kind of ayahuasca to people and to put those people in fMRI machines to try to see what's going on in their minds. And it would seem that ayahuasca, it affects the serotonin 2A receptors. It has similar effects on the brain that other psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin have. They knock out the default mode network, and they allow different parts of the brain that normally don't communicate with one another to do so. So it kind of enhances the flexibility of the communication between different neural networks. But that still doesn't explain how you see what you see when you take ayahuasca, what the images are. It doesn't explain how the plant also works on the body. It's still, I think that if anything is mysterious in this world, I mean, how ayahuasca works in people has got to be on the list of mysterious things. I mean, this is also true of most psychedelics, and that's also what's interesting about them, is that to a certain extent, they can be boiled down to molecules that can be seen as fitting into receptors on certain neurons. So you actually have a small piece of matter fitting into a kind of a lock, like a key, and then things happen in our mind. And so it's like the point where matter and mind meet, that yes, this is it's still a piece of matter, but once it actually fits into, then suddenly all these different things happen in the mind. So if we knew how that molecule fitting into that receptor actually caused, or maybe it doesn't cause, but if we knew the relationship between that molecule and then the ensuing experience we have in our minds, we'd have answered the matter mind question. It's like one of the huge questions. What is the connection between matter and mind? And, you know, this is one of these questions, like, it seems pretty obvious that you need a brain if you're going to have that kind of experience. But just like you need a piano if you're going to have a piano sonata. But it's not by studying the physics of the piano chords that you're going to understand Mozart. Yes, a piano is required, but the physics of the piano actually somehow go only so far in explaining what's happening, or what's interesting about what's happening. So that question of, you know, how does ayahuasca work inside us, is right there on that very interesting frontier. But it may be a subject where we may never know, because notice that we're trying to understand how our minds work, and we're using our minds to do that. You know, it's can you understand the thing while you with the thing itself? Can the thing itself explain itself? Maybe not. But and that's also why these psychedelics are so interesting, is because they actually allow us to explore these questions. So I guess I didn't answer your question, right?
I like that answer. And I think it's actually a good place to bring things to a close. We've covered everything I wanted to ask you about for today. There's certainly more in the book. And again, the book that we've been mostly focusing on is this one, Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and the Pursuit of Knowledge. It's accessible. It's small. You can see, you know, you don't have to spend next year reading, you know, taking the whole year to read it. It's very accessible. It's very clear, and it's very informative. And from my point of view, at least, moves the conversation forward as we deepen our understanding of plants and plant medicines, and, you know, consciousness transformation altogether. And I really appreciate the way that you're an educator, Jeremy, and in my mind, you're a good one, because you make it really clear for people to understand. So before I sign off and say thank you, excuse me, again, there's this book. You've got a few other books, including the, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think you'd consider it iconic now. I watched an interview on Psychology Today, no, pardon me, Psychedelics Today, with a fellow who talks about Salvia Divinorum, and the interviewer referenced the Cosmic Serpent. So there's those two books, and you have another one called Intelligence in Nature, and, you know, there's other work. And is there anything else that you would suggest to anyone who would like to learn more about these subjects to check into?
Well, the small book Plant Teachers has an extensive bibliography that we deliberately included, so that actually there's all kinds of good books, interesting articles that have been written about many of the subjects that we discussed today, and they're all referenced at the back of the book. So yeah, I'd invite people to sort of take a look at it and explore things according to their fancy.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Jeremy. Really appreciate your taking the time to do this. You and I know more about what time was involved in that than anyone else is going to know, and that's fine. But thank you again, and good day.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Stephen, for your excellent questions and your patience.
And likewise. Likewise, Jeremy.
Hope to speak with you again soon.
Indeed, me too. Yeah. All right. Take care.
Okay, you too.